Daniel Miller had always lived a quiet and predictable life, the kind of man who rarely strayed from his daily routines. He worked long hours at a construction company, often leaving before sunrise and returning after dusk. Neighbors described him as steady and responsible, someone who never missed a bill payment or a family gathering. His wife, Laura, often said that Daniel's reliability was both his greatest strength and his most boring trait. Yet in a small town where people valued trust and consistency, he was well liked and respected. That was why his sudden disappearance one stormy night shook the entire community to its core. It was late in the evening when Daniel was last seen. He had finished a long shift and was driving home on a stretch of road that curved sharply near a river. The storm that night was relentless, with heavy rain beating against the windshield and winds strong enough to push cars off course. When his vehicle was discovered the following morning, it painted a grim picture. The car was parked dangerously close to the guardrail, the driver's side door left wide open, as though someone had stepped out in haste. Inside, his wallet, watch, and work bag were still in place, items no one would expect a man to leave behind willingly. The police quickly theorized that Daniel must have lost control, stumbled out of the car in confusion, and been swept away by the current. It seemed like a plausible explanation, especially with the raging waters below. The search began almost immediately. Volunteers gathered along the riverbank, some carrying flashlights, others wading knee-deep into the mud, calling his name. Helicopters flew overhead while divers combed through the water. Each day that passed without a discovery only deepened the sense of dread. When cadaver dogs were brought in and still failed to find any sign of him, hope began to fade. Laura stood by during every search, her face pale and her eyes swollen from crying, often clutching Daniel's jacket to her chest, as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. People around her whispered about her strength, how she managed to keep going despite the growing certainty that her husband was gone forever. Weeks turned into a month, and the case began to lose momentum. Without a body, the authorities could not be certain, but eventually the consensus was reached. Daniel Miller had drowned. The river was notorious for swallowing people whole, its undercurrents making it nearly impossible to recover remains. His death was officially declared as an accident, a tragic misadventure that left little room for suspicion. The town mourned him collectively, with neighbors delivering food to Laura's doorstep and church members offering prayers on her behalf. Even those who did not know Daniel well found themselves affected by the story, as though the randomness of his fate reminded them how fragile life could be. Laura, now a widow in her early 40s, retreated from the world. She was seen less often, and when she did appear she dressed in muted colors, her posture heavy with grief. She declined invitations, skipped community gatherings, and avoided conversations about the future. People pitied her, and many thought she would never recover from such a devastating loss. Yet in her silence and seclusion, there was an air of mystery that some couldn't quite place. It was not unusual for widows to withdraw, but with Laura, it felt as if something more lingered behind her closed doors. Still, no one dared to question her grief openly. As the official investigation closed, the story of Daniel's disappearance faded from the headlines, but remained etched in the collective memory of the town. Children passing by the bridge would point out the spot where his car was found, their parents shushing them with reminders to show respect. Older residents would retell the tale of that stormy night, shaking their heads at the cruelty of fate. Laura's name became synonymous with tragedy, a symbol of resilience in the face of unbearable loss. What no one realized was that beneath the sorrowful image she projected, a very different story was beginning to take shape. The car, the storm, the missing body, all the details that seemed to confirm a simple accident would later be re-examined under an entirely different light. At the time, however, the truth lay buried under layers of sympathy and assumption, and the town carried on with its life while believing Daniel Miller was gone forever. The months that followed Daniel's declared death brought about changes that the town could not help but notice. At first, Laura appeared to be the embodiment of grief. She walked with slumped shoulders, her gaze fixed on the ground, and her voice was rarely heard above a whisper. Friends and relatives rallied to her side, offering meals, helping with errands, and keeping her company in the evenings. They told her she was not alone, that the community would carry her through the worst of it. But little by little, the image of the broken widow began to shift, and the transformation was impossible to ignore. When Laura filed the claim for Daniel's life insurance, most people assumed it was a formality. He had been a responsible man, and providing security for his wife in case of tragedy seemed entirely in character. Yet when the payout was announced, $500,000, people could not help but raise their eyebrows. It was a staggering sum for a man who had lived such a modest life, and whispers began circulating about why he had felt the need to take out such a large policy. Still, most brushed it off, convinced that Daniel had simply wanted to make sure Laura would be cared for. No one could have anticipated what came next. At first, Laura seemed cautious with the money. She paid off debts, made repairs to the house, and settled into a quiet routine. But within a few months, subtle changes emerged. The old furniture that had filled her home for years was replaced with sleek, modern pieces. Her car, once a reliable but aging sedan, was swapped for a gleaming luxury vehicle that caught the attention of anyone passing by. Even her clothing changed. Gone were the dark, simple dresses of mourning. In their place came vibrant colors, expensive fabrics, and accessories that sparkled under the sunlight. People who had once pitied her now began to look at her with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. The transformation did not go unnoticed by the neighbors. Some defended her, insisting that she had every right to rebuild her life and spend the money however she pleased. Others whispered behind closed doors that the changes seemed too sudden, too extravagant for someone supposedly devastated by the loss of a husband. The gossip spread from church gatherings to grocery store aisles, each retelling adding a slightly sharper edge to the story. Why was she smiling again so soon? Why was she throwing parties when not long ago she could barely leave her house? Why was she seen dining out at upscale restaurants, laughing with new acquaintances, as though the past year had not left a scar at all? Despite the murmurs, no one dared to confront her directly. To most, she remained the woman who had lost her husband in a tragic accident, and questioning her behavior felt cruel. But the police, satisfied with their conclusion of accidental death, did not revisit the case. The insurance company, too, had closed the claim and moved on. Laura was left to enjoy her new wealth without interference, though the watchful eyes of her community followed her wherever she went. Inside her home, the changes were even more striking. Friends who visited noticed bottles of expensive wine on the counter, artwork hanging on the walls, and a new entertainment system in the living room. Her once modest garden was now tended by hired landscapers, and deliveries from high-end stores arrived at her doorstep almost weekly. It was as though Laura had been waiting for this chance to reinvent herself, shedding the skin of the grieving widow to reveal a woman eager for luxury and indulgence. Yet behind the outward appearance of confidence, there were signs of unease. At times, she was seen peering through her curtains late at night, as if checking for something or someone. She often avoided direct questions about her plans for the future, changing the subject whenever the topic arose. Those closest to her noticed that she seemed restless, unable to fully relax even in her new life of comfort. It was almost as though she feared that the world she had built for herself might come crashing down at any moment. Still, outwardly, the narrative was simple. Laura had endured unimaginable loss and now was moving forward, armed with financial security. For many, that explanation was enough, and the murmurs of suspicion remained just that, murmurs. Yet for those who watched closely, there was an undeniable tension in the air, as if Laura's story was not as straightforward as it seemed. The fortune she had inherited was supposed to bring peace of mind, but instead it cast a shadow of questions that lingered unspoken. And while the town tried to carry on with its routines, The feeling that something was not quite right about Daniel Miller's death and Laura's sudden prosperity refused to fade completely. 1 year after Daniel's supposed death, the town was invited to a memorial service at the local church, arranged by Laura herself. The announcement surprised many, for she had seemed ready to leave the grief behind and embrace her new life of wealth. Some wondered why she would bring the past back into focus, after spending so many months moving forward. But others praised her for honoring Daniel's memory. Flyers went up, invitations were mailed, and the church prepared for what was expected to be a solemn gathering. On the day of the service, the building was filled beyond capacity. Relatives who had traveled from distant towns sat shoulder to shoulder with neighbors who had known Daniel all his life. The air smelled of candles and flowers, and photographs of Daniel lined the walls. Smiling portraits from his younger years, candid snapshots from family gatherings, and images of him at work created the sense that he was present in spirit. The atmosphere was heavy with silence, broken only by the soft organ music that echoed through the wooden pews. People dabbed at their eyes as they listened to words spoken about Daniel's kindness, his loyalty, and the void his absence had left behind. Laura sat near the front, dressed in black once again. Her head was lowered, hands clasped tightly in her lap, as though the service had returned her to the role she had played so convincingly in the early days of her widowhood. For many, her presence appeared to be a sign of devotion, proof that despite her recent lifestyle changes, she had not forgotten the man she once called her husband. Yet a few noticed the stiffness in her posture, the way her eyes flicked occasionally toward the entrance, as if anticipating something no one else expected. As the service reached its most solemn moment, with the congregation bowing their heads in silence, a sudden creak of the heavy church doors broke the stillness. The sound was enough to draw glances, but what followed turned those glances into gasps. A figure stepped inside, drenched in sunlight from behind, walking slowly down the aisle with measured steps. The collective intake of breath was so sharp it seemed to suck the air out of the room. People blinked, rubbed their eyes, and whispered in disbelief. Standing there unmistakably alive was Daniel Miller. The man who had been declared dead, whose supposed drowning had united the town in grief, was now walking past the pews filled with stunned faces. Some thought they were seeing an apparition, a ghost come to life. Others simply froze, their minds unable to reconcile what they were witnessing with what they had been told a year ago. Every detail confirmed his identity: the broad shoulders, the familiar gait, the stern but gentle features. He was thinner than before, his face pale and worn, but there was no denying it. Daniel had returned. Laura's reaction drew nearly as much attention as Daniel's appearance. Her body stiffened, and for a moment she looked as though the ground beneath her might give way. Her face drained of color, her hands trembling visibly in her lap. She did not rise to greet him, nor did she cry out in joy like one might expect of a woman reunited with her long-lost husband. Instead, she seemed paralyzed, as though the carefully constructed life she had built around his absence was crumbling before her eyes. The congregation, still in shock, sat in silence as Daniel reached the front of the church. He did not need to say a word. His presence was enough to send waves of unease through the crowd. The photographs on the walls, the candles burning in his memory, the very words that had just been spoken about his tragic death, all were suddenly rendered meaningless. People turned their eyes back to Laura, seeking some explanation, but she offered none. Her silence only deepened the sense that something far more complicated was unfolding. By the time the service ended, word had already begun spreading beyond the church walls. Phones buzzed with messages, and whispers turned into frantic speculation. The man believed to have drowned in the river had returned, not in rumor or dream, but in flesh and blood. The memorial, intended to close a chapter of sorrow, had instead opened a door to a mystery no one was prepared for. The aftermath of Daniel's shocking return transformed what had once been considered a tragic accident into the beginning of an investigation. that exposed layers of deception no one in the town had anticipated. Authorities, forced to reopen the case, were bombarded with questions from the press and locals alike. How could a man declared dead suddenly appear alive? Where had he been all this time? And what did it mean for the widow who had collected $500,000 in insurance money? The situation demanded answers, and soon the truth began to unravel. Daniel explained that his disappearance had not been a random accident, nor had it been an impulsive act. In the months before the stormy night when he vanished, he had begun to notice subtle, but unsettling changes in Laura's behavior. She had grown unusually fixated on their finances, often steering conversations toward the subject of life insurance. She persuaded him to increase his policy, insisting it was only a precaution, something every responsible couple should have. Though Daniel agreed reluctantly, he admitted that a strange unease had taken root in him afterward. The more he thought about it, the more convinced he became that Laura's concern was not about security, but about opportunity. On the night of his disappearance, he made a choice that would alter everything. Rather than simply returning home as usual, Daniel staged the scene near the bridge to make it appear as if he had been swept away. He left his wallet and belongings in the car to strengthen the illusion, knowing authorities would assume the river had claimed him. Then he vanished, slipping away into obscurity with nothing but a small bag and cash he had quietly saved. For months, he lived under a false identity in distant towns, taking odd jobs and avoiding contact with anyone who might recognize him. He admitted that life had been difficult and lonely, but he believed it was safer than remaining in a home where he suspected danger lurked. As Laura collected the insurance money and transformed her lifestyle, Daniel watched from the shadows, gathering pieces of evidence that reinforced his suspicions. The extravagant purchases, the abrupt change in her social habits, and the swiftness with which she embraced her new identity as a wealthy widow convinced him that her grief had been an act. To Daniel, it became clear that his staged death had not just revealed her motives, but had saved his life. He believed that had he not taken matters into his own hands, he might have ended up truly dead under mysterious circumstances. His decision to return was not made lightly. For a year, he wrestled with whether to stay hidden or expose the truth. Ultimately, he decided the memorial service provided the perfect stage. It was a symbolic moment, one where the world had gathered to close the book on his life. Walking into that church was his way of tearing the final page from the narrative Laura had written and forcing everyone to confront reality. For investigators, his account was both shocking and damning. Suddenly, Laura was no longer a grieving widow, but a prime suspect in a potential insurance fraud scheme. The evidence of her rapid financial indulgence and the pressure she had placed on Daniel to increase his coverage painted her in a calculating light. Prosecutors began building a case against her, piecing together financial records, testimony, and timelines. The community that had once pitied her now looked upon her with suspicion, and the whispers that had lingered quietly for months now erupted into open condemnation. Laura's silence did little to help her. She refused to provide explanations, often sitting in court with a blank expression, her once carefully maintained image collapsing under the weight of scrutiny. Every new detail that emerged made her appear less like a victim of tragedy and more like the architect of a scheme that had unraveled in the most public way possible. What began as a night of mourning had turned into a spectacle of revelation, exposing a story of greed, deception, and survival that left the town forever changed. The return of Daniel Miller and the revelations that followed left Laura facing a downfall more spectacular than anything the town had ever witnessed. The woman once seen as the picture of sorrow was now at the center of a storm of accusations. Her name, which had been spoken with sympathy and kindness, became tainted with suspicion and betrayal. Every neighbor who had once brought her food, every friend who had offered a shoulder to cry on, now avoided her gaze in public. Her home, once a place people visited out of compassion, became a symbol of deceit. Legal consequences soon followed. The insurance company demanded repayment of the $500,000 she had received, launching a lawsuit that stripped away nearly everything she had acquired. Luxury items were repossessed, the expensive car was taken from her driveway, and her once proud displays of wealth disappeared piece by piece. Prosecutors, fueled by Daniel's testimony and the financial records that showed her rapid spending, began building a case of insurance fraud. They argued that her actions went beyond merely claiming money in good faith. They painted her as a woman who had manipulated circumstances for personal gain, hoping never to be discovered. Court proceedings drew enormous attention. Reporters filled the gallery, their pens scratching as they documented every detail. The story had spread far beyond the boundaries of the small town, capturing national fascination. Headlines portrayed Laura as the widow who tried to profit from her husband's death, only for him to walk back into the world she had built on his grave. The narrative was irresistible, and soon her face was plastered across television screens and newspapers, her name forever tied to scandal. For Daniel, life after his return was not simple either. Though many sympathized with him, there were those who criticized his decision to vanish without alerting authorities. Some questioned whether his actions had been justified, arguing that staging his own death had caused unnecessary grief to his family and community. Others saw him as a man who had outsmarted a dangerous scheme, using deception to survive. He carried himself with quiet dignity, but the weight of his ordeal was evident in his wary expression. Rebuilding his life was no easy task. He had been gone for a year, his career disrupted, his reputation scarred by whispers and doubts. Yet he remained determined to reclaim what had been taken from him, if not in possessions, then in peace of mind. As Laura's trial progressed, the evidence mounted against her. Witnesses spoke of her sudden spending habits, her insistence on increasing Daniel's insurance coverage, and her strangely rehearsed grief. Financial records showed transfers and purchases that pointed to indulgence rather than survival. The image of the mourning widow shattered completely under the harsh light of scrutiny. Each day in court seemed to chip away at the last remnants of sympathy she might have commanded, until even her most loyal defenders were forced into silence. The verdict, when it came, marked the final chapter of her fall. She was found guilty of fraud and sentenced to prison, her carefully constructed life reduced to nothing more than a cautionary tale. The money she had once flaunted was gone, the community she had leaned on had turned its back, and the man she had tried to erase from her future had returned to expose her. The once respected woman who had walked into church pews with mournful eyes was now led away in handcuffs, her story destined to be remembered not as one of tragedy, but as one of greed and ruin. The town moved on, though the memory of the scandal lingered like a shadow over its history. People still pointed out the church where Daniel had walked in alive, recalling the shock that had rippled through the congregation. Parents told their children the story as a lesson about honesty, warning them of the consequences of deception. For Daniel, the path forward was uncertain, but he found solace in knowing that truth had finally surfaced, even if it came at a terrible cost. Laura's name faded into the archives of crime reports, while his became a reminder that sometimes survival requires choices no one else can understand. What began as a tale of sudden tragedy ended as a story of exposure and justice. The widow who believed she could turn loss into fortune instead lost everything, while the husband who was thought to be gone forever reminded the world that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of returning when least expected.